This is the real diehards, isn't it? Those who are still left. Well done,
yes,
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We so appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Matt, for the very generous introduction. I want to remind you all throughout our conversation to please tweet using hashtag #AWNewYork. I also wanted to say that we're going to be taking a few audience questions at the end. So use your Slido app within the Adweek app to submit those questions, and we'll take them in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the program. So with that, let's get started. My very esteemed panelists, Carolyn Everson, VP of Global Marketing Solutions at Facebook, and of course, Joanna Coles of Budokon. I want to talk a little bit actually first to let you introduce what you're doing from a leadership perspective. Joanna, you're obviously doing something new. I'd love for you to just brief our audience on what that is.
Yes, I'm in the hell of startup land, which is so much worse than I ever expected it to be, although I'd always looked forward to trying it. But what I want to do is to address the shortage of female leadership and diverse leadership in corporate America. And so I'm building out a newsletter and an app named Boudica, named after the first female Celtic warrior, of whom I think she would have looked something like Carolyn. And it's really, the goal is to connect women across corporate America around content. Content will be the connective tissue, but partly because I'm just horrified by the numbers out there. And when you repeat them to people, I think because of Me Too and Time's Up, everybody thinks, and partly the great numbers of women, the 108 women that got elected at the midterm elections, people think that somehow it's all 50-50 and we're all sort of now in the workplace equal. And actually, I don't want to dwell on the data, but I just want to give you 3 or 4 statistics because it's really horrifying. So of the Fortune 500 public companies, only 2% are led by women. The C-suite is 6% women, and women make up 15% of the seats on public boards. So my goal is to address and try to close the gender leadership gap, and that's what the Boudica project is all about.
And for folks in the audience that want to be following it and getting involved, how can they sign up for the newsletter? How can they follow along?
Yes, you just go to boudicamedia.com and sign up on the landing page. And our goal is to launch sometime before the holidays. That's our goal. But as I said, I'm in startup land, and it's really, really challenging, but fun, enormous fun.
It's going to be amazing.
Well, I hope it's going to be amazing.
Be.
Thank you for that vote of confidence. But it's very much about women in leadership, diverse leadership, because we are sadly lacking it.
Totally. And Carolyn, most people here at Adweek know you as a marketing leader, but you're actually somebody who's a civic leader. You're picking out societal issues that matter to you. You're engaging them within the workplace and outside of the workplace. Can we first talk about what you're doing to make sure people within Facebook are thinking about being civically minded?
So if you think about where I think just general corporate culture needs to go, people really want to know that the company they're working for has purpose and to understand the why the company exists. And there's been some companies that I think have done this superbly well. Unilever is one of them that comes to mind. From Paul Pullman to Alan Jope, the new CEO, every person you talk to at Unilever understands why they exist down to the brand level. One of my favorite examples is they have a toilet bowl cleaner brand in Europe, and that person who runs that brand doesn't talk about increasing market share for toilet bowl cleaner. He calls himself the Chief Toilet Bowl Officer, CTBO. And the reason why is because he sees the world in such a broader aperture. He sees the fact that 1 billion+ people don't have access to a toilet. And so long term, yes, the more people that get access to a toilet, the more people will need toilet bowl cleaner. There's a business benefit, but he rises above the day-to-day to say what's the societal issue. And I think at Facebook, we really hold very dear the principle, we want people to live what we feel are full lives. Meaning we don't want them to just come at work at Facebook and bang out quarterly numbers or ship a bunch of code and check the box and we've got the business thing. There's so much more to life than that. None of us on our tombstone is going to have what we accomplished at work. I can promise you that. So we then say, okay, well, what are your personal goals? And we ask people to be very explicit about those. And that can be everything from how much sleep you want to get, to how much you want to eat, and your diet, to exercise, to what kind of spouse or friend or daughter or mom or dad you want to be. And then we have a community pillar where we really ask our teams to think about the fact that we are in just the fact that we're all sitting here in this room today, we have different opportunities this week, we all have our clothes, we all were educated. These are privileges that you can very quickly take for granted, and we're trying to ask everybody at Facebook to really think about how they can contribute to a much broader sense of community. So it's built in to the DNA of our culture, and I think that turns the workplace from showing up to go to work to showing up to a place where you can really make a difference.
While we're on the topic of Facebook, let's think broadly about Silicon Valley. Joanna, you were talking to me about how you were in Silicon Valley experiencing what the culture is like there. Why are some companies getting it right and other companies, you see WeWork going through this the past week, are getting it wrong?
Oh God, how long have we got? Well, it's very difficult to sort of generalize, except that we know where some of this goes wrong is that the engineering force, which makes up so many of these big tech companies and on whom they are very reliant, are predominantly made up of men. And I was at the Nantucket project at the weekend, and one of the speakers, Joy Polly Winnie, was the whistleblower is not the right word, but she works at MIT and realized as a black woman that the AI for facial recognition had all been developed by white men, and that actually they didn't recognize black women at all. Almost all the black women that she tried through the various AIs of Google and Amazon and Microsoft identified black women as male. And of course, when she made this available and it became news, there was initial defense from the companies, and then they realized that she was right. And to their credit, they've all gone on and worked, and their accuracy is now much stronger. But it goes back to, if you only have workforces that are made of one group, you only see the world through those eyes. And I think we've seen a lot of bad competitive behavior from male leaders in the Valley. I mean, you think, I don't want to put Facebook under a particular spotlight here, but you think of the phrase that came out, the sort of move fast and break things, which turns out not to be a good slogan actually for a company, especially when you're going into countries that you don't understand fully. And I think the idea also in corporate America of always viewing everything as a market as opposed to a society is very bad. And I think what's fascinating about a lot of the companies that we can think of that have been publicly called out for bad behavior is a lot of them were set up by young men who'd never worked anywhere else, so didn't understand that offices actually are organizations and organisms of people, and you have to build in systems and processes to make sure that things don't get out of hand. And I think, you know, the media loves the narrative of the lone young male founder who's left college early and is creating his unicorn. And we have to work against that to some extent, because the romanticizing of these characters isn't good for their workforces, and clearly it's not good for the culture. And I mean, the most extraordinary thing this week we've seen of the collapse of, I think it's the biggest reduction of any shareholder value, certainly in living memory, at WeWork, with this, you know, the cult that grew around this larger-than-life character, and the pressure on, I think, some of these leaders to outperform in all ways the one that went before.
Yeah, to become a caricature
Yep.
of themselves.
Yep.
I want to go back to your first point about the engineers. When you're in Silicon Valley, you know, Carolyn, I talk to leaders there all the time. One of the things they'll say is, sometimes this is a problem that feels bigger than us. It's systemic in society. We don't have engineering programs for women that are celebrating women in all parts of the country. So how does a company like Facebook ensure that they don't have a problem like Amazon due to the fact that society writ large is not necessarily bringing in the type of diverse talent that they're going to need to, you know, power their business?
So there's definitely a pipeline talent problem, but it's also not accurate for any engineer or leader to say that there is no talent out there. And I think that is a cop-out and an excuse that so many leaders sometimes say when they have trouble recruiting diverse candidates. And I think that's unacceptable. Okay, it's hard. Well, it's your job to go do it. It's your job to get a diverse slate approach. The numbers were around about 18% for computer science degrees for girls. That is improving. It's improving pretty steadily. It's in the 20s now. We work with Girls Who Code, which is an organization. We support a lot of efforts in the school system because you do need more women. But it's not just women. I mean, one of the things, and I'm really glad, Joanna, that you mentioned the Black woman that talked about AI. We have been very focused, I think, around gender equality, as we should. The numbers are pitiful, right? She reviewed them for the Fortune 500 and boards. But the numbers are so much worse for women of color and people of color. It's not just women of color, it's men too. And I think we need a much broader lens when we talk about this subject from a leadership point of view. We've had our own issues with technology. When we developed Portal, the AI that Joanna is talking about was also problematic to identify. Part of the Portal product is that it follows you around when you're talking so that the camera can follow you. It had a hard time detecting people of color. But we had enough engineers, not nearly enough, but at least a few that identified that there was an issue there. And imagine if we didn't. There is this famous, you can Google it, it's like an unbelievable story of, you know how you have hand wash dispensers, automatic ones? When those first came out, if you were a person of color and put your hand under it, you didn't get any soap because there was not a single Black person that worked on that project. So these things shipped all over the place and no one was getting soap. Like, it's 2019. We need to hold ourselves much more accountable for doing a much better job on this.
To follow up to that, I think that there are always going to be ways where people get it wrong, technology gets it wrong, and that's okay. Facebook recently announced sort of an appeals court, a Supreme Court, so that if its technology blocks your posts or asks to take something down, and they might think it's unjust, you can come back and appeal it. Can you just walk us through that process and also walk us through Mark Zuckerberg's role in overseeing that process, diversity, et cetera?
So, look, I appreciate the way Joanna feels that perhaps some of these founders might be romanticized, but that's not the Mark that I know, and that's not the Mark that I have worked for almost 9 years. The Mark that I work for, and I think the almost 40,000 plus of us work for, is somebody that has been resolute and deeply passionate about giving people voice and sees a world where with people that don't have voice, it becomes incredibly restricting for them. They don't have opportunities to build a business. They don't have an opportunity to vote. They don't have an opportunity to participate in society in the way that a lot of us probably take for granted in the Western world. Facebook is beloved way more in countries that don't have necessarily a full democracy and equal rights because people are so desperate to have that voice. And Mark's been committed to that from the very, very beginning. He's also somebody that donated 99% of his wealth, was the youngest person to ever do that. Well, that story gets told for 5 seconds, and that doesn't get told again. And every single day that money is being used to better health and education. There is no question that we have had our challenges, absolutely. And part of it is, as Joanna said, the company, when they grow quickly, we don't necessarily have all of the systems and processes and checks and balances that need to be in place. We're also dealing with a topic when you take speech and the oversight board, where there is no global definition of what actually is speech that is appropriate. We have a free speech world. That's our amendment. We have that here in the US. Other people, their speech is highly restrictive. What somebody will say in Thailand about the king you could be put in jail for. Other people are allowed to fully criticize politicians and whomever else. So there is no global framework for how to think about content and speech. And so what do? Well, you can do as much as you can as an individual company. which you put the community standards, you try to train people, you try to have a diverse set of people from all around the world that speak over 100+ languages, from religion, sexual orientation, all of that. You do that. You try to have the same level of input into AI to try to catch the stuff that's bad. But Facebook doesn't want to be the company that's deciding what's appropriate and what's not. And so 2 things. We started an oversight board, and Mark was really passionate to say, we don't have all the answers. We need to get other people, a cross-section of the community, to help us so that if there's an appeal process, they have somebody to go to. But even more broadly, there likely needs to be regulation around this, because Facebook could decide one thing, Google could decide something else, Snap and Twitter, we all go in different directions, and that's maybe not good either. And so some sort of framework around what content is appropriate, we think is very important. And the Mark that I know shows up, works every day tirelessly to try to always improve. He's also deeply intellectual curious. He has deep intellectual curiosity. And so he is always trying to figure out where we can be better, what can we learn. And he did start Move Fast, Break Things. There was posters everywhere when I got there 9 years ago. And then there was a rude awakening. That's actually not okay. And that can't be core to the culture. And those all came ripped off the walls. And it was like, slow down. You're now dealing with almost 3 billion people on the planet that use your services. You can't just move fast and break things. It's not okay.
So when we're talking about this, though, I think we can be really reflective. Okay, here's what we did wrong, here's what we learned. But today's employees, especially millennials, they don't want to give executives the time to reflect. In fact, they don't even want to give executives the time to make a mistake and learn from it. They want action now. And so I know you have teenage daughters, you have young boys. Like, what's your take on the new Gen Z workforce that's coming in? Are they going to listen to someone like Carolyn explain this and be patient, or are they going to demand action?
Well, it's a great question, and I think one of the interesting things about talking to leaders is you realize how incredibly nerve-wracking it is to be a CEO or a leader now in the days of Twitter and Facebook, when all it takes is a disgruntled tweet from one employee or one customer actually to bring the house down. And you see what happened, obviously, with Susan Fowler with her blog at Uber. And that's just one of many examples. And what you realize there is that she had tried to surface her concerns within the company on several occasions, but the internal systems and processes that we were talking about earlier just weren't taken seriously. So no one was listening. And what's absolutely clear for CEOs and leaders is that you have to build in systems that react quickly when people have a complaint. Now, it could be that the complaint is trivial and to somebody it's bigger than actually it feels within the context of the company, but it may also be something in Susan Fowler's case that then hits a nerve and then sparks an entire revolution within a company, which ends up ultimately overturning the board and ousting the very founder of the company. So it's very clear that there need to be systems that react quickly. And if there are marketers in this room, and obviously there are, you have to have social listening, and it has to be happening 24/7, because if you miss the one tweet that everybody sees and it goes viral, then you can look at losing your brand. So I think it's very nerve-wracking now being a modern leader, and I think everything has speeded up, and your response has to speed up. Sometimes you have to apologize even when you don't know what you're apologizing for, but it's easier to cauterize the complaint. And this is not how leaders have been trained, especially older white male leaders who've been trained to think that they got this, that they're in control, that they're surrounded by people who look like them and they can all deal with this. And I think you're seeing a new kind of humility in the best modern leaders coming out, who understand that they are at the mercy is not quite the right expression, but they are working on behalf of their consumers and their staff. It's not that they're leading everybody now.
I want to pick up on Joanna's, she used the term humility, and one of the things that I've been working on for a few years now, and it's starting to get ready to come out, but I'll just lay out some ideas for our discussion, which is when you boil it down, what are the most important qualities of a leader? And the framework that I have is that they all happen to end in Y, they're qualities. But I'm gonna share a few just to give you a flavor, because I don't think any of these words or qualities are being taught in any sort of traditional school environment. I'll go through these names. I would barely remember one of them when I went to business school. Authenticity. Gen Z wants leaders to be authentic. Bravery. As a leader, you have to be willing to take bold risks and move the ball down the field. I mentioned curiosity before. Leaders have to understand what they know, but more importantly, what they don't know. And I think you have to realize that every single day is a new opportunity for you to learn. You might learn from the 22-year-old that's just joined your company, or you might learn a new technology that's fundamentally changing your vertical. Diversity. You have to have the broadest lens of diverse thinking. We talk a lot about gender, as I said. I think the conversation has to move way beyond gender. We have to talk about ethnic diversity, sexual orientation, disabled, you go down the list, religious, age, et cetera. We have to have a much broader aperture. Empathy. I think people want to work with leaders that have empathy for positions that other people might be in that you are not yourself. Your customers and your clients want you to understand that their business might be not growing, or maybe it's declining, and your business is going up this way. Well, you better think through, what is it like to be in that person's chair? Generosity. Leaders that are overly generous, that give more of themselves than take. Humility. I think it's critical. We barely talk about the importance of humility in leadership. Know when you're wrong. Know when to just say, I don't know the answer. Invite that vulnerability is really important. Resiliency, transparency, vulnerability. These are the qualities that are not in business school textbooks. They're rarely talked about. They're typically can skew more towards female. When you look at the makeup of female, that might be stereotypical, but typically that doesn't mean I have so many incredible men on my team and they check the box and more so on those qualities. But that's, I think, where the future of leadership is. People want to know that they're working with a human being that has a beating heart and not just somebody in their head cranking out the analysis.
I think that's very well put, all those.
It's so interesting because I think we always think about leaders in terms of nouns. I need them to be a broker, a deal maker. I need them to be a leader, not what type of a person that they are. So that's very, very compelling. But I do have not a pushback, but just something that I worry about is that, you have a lot of young females entering the workforce. I know I felt this way. And there is a pressure to be brave and to be forward-thinking and to take risks. And certainly that defines the both of you. But there's also a hesitation amongst a lot of young women that I might come off too bossy. I might come off too pushy. Joanna, how do you balance that expectation in a world which is not used to having women who are risk takers and forward-thinking, et cetera?
Well, I think that it all comes down to the work, right? You don't want to be making brave or risky decisions unless you've done the prep work for it. And success creates its own momentum. And none of this is substitute for actually doing the work. You're not going to get to be a leader unless you've actually done the work that at least gives you the confidence to be in the chair. And I do think with Gen Z and some of the younger millennials, there is this great impatience and speed to want to do things that you're not yet quite set up to do. And so as long as you're doing the work and as long as you're seeing results from it and you know it's going in the right direction, that gives you confidence to make momentous decisions, which might seem a risk, but actually it's a calculated risk. And you have to accept that if you're going to be a successful leader, there's got to be room for error too. Hopefully not egregious error, but some error. But I think there is no substitute for doing the work, doing the prep work, doing more prep work than is necessary, because you then set yourself up for success.
Sarah, I've had confidence issues for many, many years. So this is like, you could say, yes, Joanna and Carolyn, you've taken bold risks and you're brave. And you'd look at the resume and say, okay, she went here and here, and it all looks like a progression, that it was all planned and it was confidence every step of the way. It wasn't. I was fired from my own company during business school that I had started, and that rocked my confidence for well over 10 years. I didn't even talk about it. Nobody even knew that I was the founder of Pets.com. the infamous sock puppet, because I erased it. It was not on my resume. I didn't talk about
You're
it.
the founder of pets.com?
Yeah, I had no idea.
Right.
Well, there you go. You learned something new if you came to this today. Yes.
Okay, so what's your advice then for people who do go through a situation where their confidence is totally rocked? Like, how did you overcome that?
So it took many, many years to get there, and a lot of, I think.
Why were you ousted?
So the quick story is that I was in business school, 1997 to 99, heyday of the first .com, craziness. Wrote the business plan, met the person who owned the domain name. Back then, people used to buy domain names. We partnered. We raised $5 million from Hummer Winblad, basically in April of my second year. So I would have graduated in May. And we decided we were going to hire a CEO. I was totally on board with that, but it was Hummer's decision because they had put in the money. They brought a CEO in. I flew out to meet her. In that meeting, it was totally clear she was going to take the business one way, and I thought she was, unfortunately, incredibly incorrect with what she wanted to do. I'm not mentioning her name, but
okay,
I
know
can
who
put
it
it
was.
together.
Yeah, okay.
And she fired me. Wow. She sent a fax to my dorm room, and by the time I got back to business school, I was fired. I had the equity in the company, but it was the worst IPO disaster in the history of the .com era. And so how I got over it eventually was Cheryl at one point said to me backstage, true story, before I was getting in front of a big group at Facebook, about 1,000 women. She goes, sometimes I feel like you have confidence issues. And I turned to her and I go, because I was fired. And she was like, what? She had no idea because I'd never talked about it. Wow. And then I started talking about it, but it's the inner voice. That's the one thing I want to leave this room with. And
The
Lisa
imposter
McCarthy
syndrome.
has done so much work with me on this, but it's the inner voice that tells you your boss just called and you missed it. He's calling you because you're getting fired. Somebody calls a meeting at Friday at 5 o'clock. That's when they fire people. I'm definitely getting fired. And that lived with me for many, many years. But it takes time to recognize the voice. I've now named it. It's Penelope. Sorry if there's a Penelope in the room. But I've named it, and I recognize it. And you have to think, and that can do self-esteem, body image things for girls. Think of all the things that go on in your inner voice. It can be very, very destructive.
Okay, so last question before we get to audience questions for the both
I have to say,
of you.
I've just found that riveting, and I'm also very impressed that you told everybody in front of a live audience. It's really interesting, really interesting.
Thank you for that. I think for a lot of people who have really strong support systems, it can be easier to cope with that inner voice because you have a mom or you have a dad or a friend that you can call. You might be able to take a few bucks and go see a movie with your friends, but there are some people who don't have the type of coping mechanisms and resources to be able to get over something like that. They don't necessarily have a support system of someone to call. So I just want to get your reaction to what can we do to find those women, the women who don't have the same resources, maybe that all we do being here at Adweek, to help bolster them when maybe they get rejected?
Look, that is a very important question because I will say that I have an unbelievable support system. I think that is one of the biggest privileges I have in my life. I have an unbelievably supportive husband who's decided to stay at home for the last 7 years to allow me to do what I do at Facebook. I have 2 sons, 2 daughter-in-laws, my twins. I have 2 grandchildren. I have my parents, my brother, my sister. I have best friends that I say I've gathered and accumulated in my life that make it richer. My team. I mean, I have concentric circles of people that I can turn to and have been there for me through thick and thin. If I didn't have that, I think that would be probably one of the most loneliest places to be. So your question is, what would I say to somebody that doesn't have that? I would say that we've got to find those people. If we see people on our teams that and there's mental health is a real serious issue in the workforce. It's something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. I ask my team to evaluate their spiritual energy, their emotional energy, their mental energy, and their physical energy. They do audits. And typically, mental energy or emotional are the ones that are most drained. Wow. And that is a serious problem. And I would say, as leaders, you've got to be talking about mental health in the workplace. You have to create an environment where people feel like they can be their full self. and you've got to try to be available and accessible. And the more you talk about it, the more it destigmatizes it for people. And that's the environment that, I certainly try to create, but I'm sure I could do a lot better. I think we all could do better.
Yeah, just keeping your eyes open.
So I think that one of the reasons that I'm trying to build Boudica is exactly to deal with this issue. And funnily enough, one of the first video mashups that we have is about how to deal with imposter syndrome. And we have a collection of extremely senior CEOs and CMOs all talking about how they do it. And we have one of the people we interviewed is Stephanie McMahon, who runs WWE and who is the only woman to have pinned The Rock. And she has confidence issues. And you look at her and she's glorious. She can pin The Rock. And yet she is completely unable sometimes to walk into a room. And she says that what she does, and this is, part of our content will be showing people talking about work in a much more vulnerable, authentic way than you ever see on corporate videos. And so we've had a lot of people open up to us. And she says, what I do is I give myself the self-talk. And the self-talk is make eye contact, walk into a room, shake someone's hand. And we have extraordinary stories from someone, Wendy Clark, who many of you will know as, one of the most powerful CEOs in the whole of corporate America, but certainly in advertising. Has an expression where she says, you've got to shut that bitch up. She's sitting on your shoulder and she's telling you can't do this.
Penelope.
She is just, that's her.
Yep, Wendy and I have had that conversation. I love it.
Yeah, and it's that sense of you have to acknowledge it, you have to own it, and then you have to move forward.
There is a few audience questions that I want to get to, and there's one on here, and I'm dying to get your take on this, Joanna, which is how do we address the culture of underpaying women? How do you talk about it in the workforce, and do you foresee it getting any better?
Well, I think you just have to ask for the data and be really consistent about asking for the data. And I will give you one anecdote of asking for the data. And also what happens annoyingly is when you're a woman and you ask for the data, you get put in charge of finding the data, which has happened to me on a couple of occasions. But I do remember one event where we asked for the data. A female colleague really did the hard work. But when she came back, the data was so bad that they didn't want us to discuss it in the meeting. And in fact, what we ended up doing was discussing other people's data. And then everybody was given a left behind. But there's nothing that is better or more efficient than just getting the data and asking for it. And then also, if you have a sense that you're being underpaid, leaving and going somewhere else. I think that people get stuck in corporate America and think that they can't leave. And actually, often the most effective thing to do is to leave.
And you left, right?
I did leave, although I didn't leave over issues to do with not being paid well, to be fair.
Yes, and what does it feel like now being on the outside looking in at corporate America trying to build something new? What's your perspective?
Well, it's very exciting. I wanted to take a more entrepreneurial path. I'd had a fantastic 12-year run at Hearst, but I was ready to do something that I wanted to build, and I could frankly see a need for it. All the women I was lucky enough to talk to in my network, and I would include Carolyn in that, a lot of us had the same issues. And as you go up corporate America, and there are fewer and fewer of you, it gets more and more difficult. It gets harder to be heard. There's so much data around the idea of solo status when you are the only woman in the room, or when you're the only diverse person in the room, that people don't see you. And we know it statistically. You get talked over, you get ignored, your ideas get presented by someone else as if they've come up with your idea. It's just what happens. So you have to build a community, and you have to build numbers within any corporation for the diverse voice to feel free enough to actually express itself. And that's very common. So that's why I'm building the platform, and I just wanted to build something. I'd spent a lot of time with founders. I'm on 3 boards, all of which are founder-led companies, and I wanted to try the journey myself. Who knows how it will end up? That's my vulnerability, admitting it's unbelievably hard, but it's incredibly interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're gonna all go to Boudica Media, so hopefully
Yes,
we'll give it a boost after this.
Yeah.
There's a question on here that I think a lot of women want to ask and are curious about. I'm going to throw it to you, Carolyn, which is, if you are not a minority woman, if you're a woman that is white, how do you talk about bringing in diversity? How do you address the fact that in a room of peers, even though there might be a lot of women, there aren't a lot of women of color or a lot of women from different ethnicities? How do you talk about it?
So this is a journey that I've been on for probably a good 2.5 years, which is I tried to look and said, okay, well, if I have a voice and I can try to be helpful in this dialogue, I do think there's a lot of white women talking about gender, and how can I maybe contribute in a little bit of a different way. And my background from when I was very young, I've always been trying to fight for people that are underrepresented. I mean, back in high school, AIDS was coming out and everyone was super afraid of it, and I was fighting for AIDS education. And I remember having to go to the school board and battle because they were afraid if I brought somebody in with AIDS that used the water fountain, like everyone was going to get infected. I mean, that's what I was dealing with. And so whether it's that or other issues, I've always tried to say, where can I help people that perhaps don't have the same voice or are underrepresented? And so that was one piece. The second piece, my childhood best friend, who I've known since I'm 9 years old, he is a Korean American, and he took over Ashley Stewart, which is the largest employer of Black and Hispanic women in the country. It's a retailer. He took it over when it was going bankrupt. They were about to literally sell the scrap metal to make payroll. No Wi-Fi, nothing, no investment in the company. And he went in and bought it because he said the women there reminded him of his mother, who was an immigrant in this country. And he felt like if I don't fight for them, who is going to fight for them? And he and I have talked quite a lot about how can we help people that don't have that voice. And so that is where I've been focused on. But as I say, I'm early in the journey, even though I've been doing it for a few years, because every day I learn something new. I've learned, for example, we have people of color that work at Facebook, obviously. Let's say they've only ever talked to their client by phone. Then suddenly they have video access. And the client or the partner might treat them differently because now they've suddenly seen that they look different than they thought. I never would have even imagined that. Yeah. But that is happening because there is unconscious bias throughout the system. And so what I'm trying to do a lot is listen. I've hosted dinners where I'm the only white woman in the room, and I want to know what that feels like because so often a woman of color is definitely the only woman of color in the room. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to put myself into situations that are not typical of what I would have normally done so I can learn, listen, and then figure out how I can be helpful. So that's early in the journey, but that's what I'm focused on.
And I think, it's exhausting to be the only in a room. I mean, whatever you are the only of, because you end up taking on the full mantle of representation. And I was out actually at an even bigger tech company than Facebook a couple of weeks ago in the Valley, talking to a couple of black women there who say that often they feel that they might be the only black woman that this person has ever spoken to, and inevitably Wow. It will be a white man. And so you have the burden of being that representative as well as just trying to be yourself and be your authentic self, which is ultimately all you can do. But this is why it's so important to get beyond just having one person of diversity in the room. Whatever the diversity is, you need more than one to actually feel free to express yourself.
How do you think we're doing? I mean, we're at Ad Week. How do you think this industry, advertising and marketing, is doing? What's the report card?
Go ahead. No, please.
Well, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, so this morning we led Mark Pritchard, who's incredibly passionate about this topic, and I brought together about 22 people in a room that are all focused on diversity and inclusion initiatives in the advertising and marketing industry. Everything from the workplace, so the inclusive 100 list, to diagnosing whether or not you are being able to recruit, retain, your performance management, where the bias is, to what do your ads look like. There are tools to now review script bias ahead of time, to reviewing the ads to make sure they're unstereotyped, all the way. So the entire ecosystem with the ultimate sort of goal of 3 outcomes. 1, to eliminate bias and to represent all people. That's number 1. Number 2, to to have proportionate representation throughout the entire ecosystem. People behind the camera, people in leadership positions, people in boards, all of it. And number 3, to cultivate a community of people so that once you recruit them, they feel included. This was an incredibly important dialogue this morning because these 20 so organizations are doing unbelievable work, but we've got to bring them together to figure out we're all climbing the mountain, but we're not sure we're all climbing the same mountain. And so that was really important. But the reason why I think we have to do the best job out of any industry, all industries need improvement on diversity and inclusion, but we have a responsibility because we control the images that people see. And this industry has largely contributed to the bias that exists in society because we showed the woman only in the kitchen.
Well, and I would argue, just coming in, and I was on this stage with Mark on Monday, and actually they have a brilliant ad which is just called The Look, which I really urge you, if you get the opportunity to search for it on YouTube, it's fantastic. But this, I mean, first of all, advertising has been absolutely terrible at it. Secondly, consumers have voted with their feet. Any opportunity to block an ad or avoid an ad or skip to the end of the ad, the consumer will do because the advertising is not good enough. But what's driven these changes is not the ad industry itself. It's consumers who now have the option to opt out of looking at advertising. So I think it's, I mean, you're so much more enthusiastic than I am about all things, in fact, but which is good for the world, much better for the world that you are. But I think the industry's been appallingly slow at it, disappointingly slow. And happily, Gen Z and millennial users are making their thoughts about advertising very clear, and advertisers are suddenly having to step up. And actually, I do think P&G is doing a good job trying to actually create conversation pieces as opposed to advertising and doing much, much lighter touch with the branding. But when you think about some of the really ridiculous ads that, you know, women having orgasms because they're using a certain shower gel, it's humiliating to even have to take part as a viewer of that kind of media.
Yeah, humiliating is a good word.
I don't want to be, yes, I am optimistic about this. We still have a ton of work to do. My thing is that out of any industry that needs to get this right and be the model, it better be this industry because we control the messages that people see and we are behind them, and that is what influences society and bias. And it is very clear, and P&G is a great example, but Unilever, all of them who are really focused on this, it's not only the right thing to do, so if you have a moral imperative, it's the right thing to do, but it's also good for business.
It's for business, yeah.
That's what consumers are expecting now.
We have just a few seconds. Can you each leave us with someone to Google when we get home to learn more about who is leading the front that's impressed you on all of these types of issues?
Well, I would honestly urge you to Google The Look. It's a really interesting conversational piece about what it feels like to be a black man. And it didn't go at all where I thought it was going to go, and it felt refreshing and exciting content, and it's sponsored by P&G, put together by Radical Media, and I thought it was really an exciting piece of branded content that you could actually do something with.
The way I would phrase it, Sarah, is look at the leaders that are thinking about going from success to significance and having an impact that's much broader than just their core business. And so to me, that's a Paul Pullman at Unilever. Yes, he's a white man, but he deserves accolades because of what he's done, particularly with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and driving purpose, and Alan at Unilever. I'd look at Doug McMillon at Walmart, who bravely took on gun violence when the shooting happened in El Paso. He didn't have to do that, and in many ways it could be perceived as risky, given Walmart serves the entire the broad population.
The shooting did happen in a Walmart. I mean, I agree with you, but I mean, it was if you couldn't address it then when would you address it? But I agree, he took a leadership position, but when a mass shooting happens in one of your stores, if you can't stand up, then I don't know when you can.
So, but I'm thankful he stood up. As somebody that's working on gun safety, the fact that Doug stood up. And yes, you're right. If he doesn't do it then when would you do it? I agree, but he did, and other leaders now are stepping out. So to me, I'm looking for leaders that are brave and stepping out on social issues.
Perfect. we want to just, before we let you go, I come from a company called Axios. We love to end everything on one fun thing. So here's our one fun thing. We're just going to do a quick wrap-up of what we learned today. I loved Joanna's stats from the very beginning, that just 2% of Fortune 500 companies are led by women. Women make up 15% of the seats on public boards. If you want to learn more about this, definitely go to bouticamedia.com when it launches later this year. Carolyn, no one has their work life on their tombstone. Super important value to think about every single day when we go to work. Joanna, most engineers in the Valley are predominantly white, and that is impacting a lot of the engineering decisions that we're seeing in places like Amazon. Even the example that you noted with Facebook and Portal was really important, because I hadn't thought about it that way. And thank you for enlightening us with the soap example. I will think about that every time I wash my hands.
Google that. Everybody should Google that.
It's unbelievable. Not the Mark that you know. I thank you for explaining to us sort of a little bit of an inside look into Mark Zuckerberg. I think, I'm in Washington. We see him coming to Capitol Hill in a suit. We don't really know the man behind the man, so thank you for explaining some of that.
Sarah, can I just say one thing more?
Yes.
Remember that Mark's a dad, and he has 2 daughters. And so every time you look at him in the press or making a speech and you think through a lens, at the end of the day, remember, he goes home to take care of those 2 daughters, and he wants the world to be a better place for them.
And a very big, shaggy dog. Joanna, I love what you mentioned. One tweet can throw an entire company into chaos. So marketers, you need to be doing real-time listening all of the time, as do CEOs and leaders. Carolyn, looking at now the new leader needs to have a slew of adjectives, not just a slew of nouns. You need to be thinking about diversity and authenticity and bravery. All of those things matter. Joanna, when it comes to women who are in the audience thinking about getting a raise and might be underpaid, ask for the data. And then finally, 2 pieces of homework for everyone here in the office. Google the look from P&G, the ad that Joanna mentioned, and then also take a look at leaders who Carolyn says have really moved from success to significance, leaders who are taking a stand on social issues, whether it's guns or something else. I want to thank all of you for joining us today at Ad Week. Thank you again to Matt for having us, to all of the staff who've worked to make this possible. Thank you so much, and thank you to those who submitted questions.
Thank you.